You're listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. The topic for this podcast is why climate finance is a big deal. Source for the content is Simran Siroor's article for the print. One of the most contested issues being negotiated at the COP26 in Glasgow is climate finance. Funds that will help developing countries cope with climate change. Climate finance has been a subject for debate for years, but it has acquired a particular significance this year as the 26th Conference of Parties is where matters relating to a new climate finance goal under the 2015 Paris Agreement will be settled. The new goal will define how money will be raised and transferred to developing countries after 2025 to reduce or remove emissions and adapt to the changing climate. Discussions have been anything but straightforward since developed countries have failed to deliver on their past promises of raising climate finance. As climate change worsens, costs of preventing and coping with it will only mount, and so developing countries argue that the corpus of climate finance should grow. Apart from mitigation and adaptation, developing countries have said climate finance should also cover loss and damage due to climate change, an aspect that developed countries are hesitant to commit to. Here's a look at what climate finance is, how it works, and why it's becoming such a hot topic. Let's talk about the $100 billion goal first. In 2009, during the 15th COP, it was decided that high-income developed countries would mobilize $100 billion for developing nations to cope with mitigation and adaptation by 2020. This was done in the spirit of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which recognizes the needs and abilities of different countries. This commitment was reaffirmed during the COP21 in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed and extended till 2025. But developed countries have had a poor track record when it comes to raising this money. These funds have been tracked by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is OECD, an intergovernmental organization of 38 developed countries. So the OECD maps money that is transferred in four ways: bilaterally, multilaterally, export credits, that is government financial support given to foreign buyers, and private investments mobilized by public finance. Data shows that till 2019, only $79 billion had been mobilized, an increase of just 2% compared to 2018. These countries were supposed to have raised $100 billion by 2020, but recently admitted they will be unlikely to do so before 2023, 3 years after the original deadline. The OECD and the $100 billion goal have been criticized by developing countries over the years for a number of reasons. One criticism is that a large portion of reported figures represent commitments and not dispersed flows. Another is that these flows are not entirely new and additional. Existing development finance reclassified as climate finance accounts for a portion of the reported figures, said Arjun Dutt, program lead at the Non-Profit Council for Energy, Environment and Water. Also, the reported figures contain a small fraction of concessional finance in the form of grants and soft loans. There are also concerns that this finance isn't being counted in addition to existing green finance, which could mean it's being counted twice. Developing countries have also said the OECD isn't a neutral enough body to be tracking finance since it is made up of developed countries who are self-reporting. Lorena Gonzalez, senior associate at the nonprofit World Resources Institute, noted, and I quote her here, two main things developing countries criticize when it comes to the $100 billion goal. One is that there is an imbalance when it comes to mitigation versus adaptation funding, with mitigation getting a larger share. There are also serious concerns about the quality of the finance, she said. According to the OECD, 50.8% of funds in 2019 were for mitigation purpose. For example, investments into renewable energy, while only 20.1% were for adaptation. Adaptation activities like setting up early warning systems and building more resilient infrastructure are considered less profitable than mitigation activities, which are technology heavy. Further, a substantial chunk of this finance came in the form of loans, with just 19% as grants. These loans are pushing poorer, low-income countries into debt, the Guardian reported. Money flows to larger economies where investments can make profits. That explained. India, for instance, has been among the biggest recipients of climate finance because wind and solar energy are regarded as commercially viable investments. Private capital generally flows to commercially viable investment opportunities. This may not be true of investments in market segments where technology performance track records or business models are not well established, such as off-grid renewables, storage, and the vast majority of adaptation activities. Risks are also high for investments in a number of underdeveloped countries. Public capital can be used to underwrite investment risks through instruments such as guarantees and thereby mobilize many multiples in private capital flows. Such a catalytic role is also the most efficient use of scarce public capital. Lastly, the $100 billion figure was arrived at without any scientific reasoning or clear understanding of how much mitigation and adaptation will cost. A United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance report said countries would need between $5.8 to $5.9 trillion by 2030 to meet 40% of their climate goals under the Paris Agreement. Alright, now moving on to climate finance negotiations at COP26. At the COP26 negotiations, developing countries have said they need much more than $100 billion in climate finance and have emphasized that developed countries must, at the very least, reach this goal as soon as possible. More significantly, negotiations are focused on what shape the new collective quantified goal on climate finance to kick in after 2025 will look like. The developing countries are pushing to create a roadmap of this goal as soon as possible so that there are no delays in its implementation, but developing countries are resisting these attempts. India, along with African group of countries, has asked for at least $1.3 trillion a year in climate finance. But countries like Australia, Norway, and the EU don't want to settle on a figure. There has also been a call by developing countries, particularly small island states, for loss and damage finance. Loss and damage happens when the effects of climate change are so catastrophic that countries simply cannot adapt to it. The rationale is that developed countries should pay for the climate change impacts being borne by countries that aren't responsible for global warming but are extremely vulnerable to it. A draft of the COP26's cover decision, which sets the tone for current and future negotiations, includes a section on loss and damage for the first time. But climate activists say there need to be more provisions. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the ICE exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com. Thanks for listening.